Well, welcome everybody to the penultimate seminar in this series, the last one of the calendar year, but there's one more to go. Don't forget the 29th of January when we're having our in-person and online final wrap-up session with, among others, Sir Lawrence Freedman. So do sign up for that if you haven't already. But tonight we're having a different perspective, an international perspective on on official history, because I think we tend to be quite parochial in our understanding of what it means. But here we have two examples from Australia and from the Netherlands of other ways of doing it, or perhaps not. We'll see. The two speakers are Rhys Crawley from the University of New South Wales in Canberra and Azarja Harmanny from the Netherlands Institute of Military History. And Rhys will be talking about official history in Australia, and Azarja, we were talking about the Dutch tradition in official brackets or semi-official history. We'll see what that means. The usual sort of ground rules apply. This event is being recorded. Please make your comments or questions in the chat, and we can pick them up as we go along towards the end, or of course raise your hand during the discussion. And both our speakers will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for general discussion. Okay, so Rhys is going to kick off first. So Rhys, thanks very much. It's over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. It's always fun to talk about official histories. I would describe myself as an official history junkie ever since getting my PhD. Actually, just before I got my PhD, I've been working on official histories. So I've worked on 3 official history projects. I am still working on one. And I guess it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, because I'm working on a live official history project. I'm not going to talk about the content of that, but we can talk about process and methodology. And I'm happy to answer any questions, and we just, be a bit cautious about what we discuss. It's only appropriate to sort of keep those within our own project in Australia. Today, I thought in sort of 20 minutes, I wanted to discuss the traditions of official history in Australia and talk a little bit about where official history is at today. As I said, I've worked on 3, so there is a very sort of robust and current official history program in Australia. And I also want to talk a little bit about some of the processes and methodologies and then leave plenty of time for questions. And I think it's in those questions where we'll tease out some of the similarities and differences between what Azarja will tell us about how this has been done in the Netherlands, and also I think some similarities and differences to how official history has been done and is being done elsewhere. I think before we get to that, it's really important to point out what official history is in Australia. That word official can cause some confusion at times. In Australia, it has always meant and still does mean that those writing the official history are given privileged access to the official records. So it's more based on the archival terminologies of official being government records and private being private records. So we are, in an official history project in Australia, given first access to those official records that quite often have not made their way to the archives yet. They are still working files within their parent departments. It is, and what we produce are books for the public, but they are not the government's view. They are our views as historians based on access to those government records. That word official, though, I think does create some confusion in that, and even within bureaucracies, people will wonder whether this is meant to be the government's view, or there'll be perceptions that it is the government's view, but that has not been the case in Australia. And certainly the historians want to make it very clear that the books, and that includes the conclusions, whether they're right or wrong, are those of the historians. We're not from within those departments. And we can talk about that a little bit more. But government does fund these projects, and they fund them to different extents. So the current project that I'm working on, which is Afghanistan, but also includes Iraq and East Timor, is a multi-million-dollar project funded by government. And what that does is allow teams to spend time working through the masses of information to produce these authoritative histories. So government does foot the bill. It hasn't always met the entire costs of that. Sometimes it's been universities or other institutions that have given in-kind support, but currently the government is funding the entire official history project and not giving us any direction on what we can or cannot produce. So the historians in Australia, there is an official historian appointed by the government. So their commission comes from the Prime Minister, and they are the lead of the project, and then they appoint historians to write volumes in an official history project. But there's only one official historian for the project, and that is not me. I'm one of the authors. And so that is an important distinction to make, because I don't sort of come to this project with the authority of the Prime Minister, but my boss, Professor Craig Stockings, does. And the official historians in Australia have always come from outside of government. They are academics, they are professors of history, and they generally appoint people that are from outside of government as well. Sometimes they have to be brought into government to be given security clearances, and because it's government that administers the finances, but we all see ourselves very much as academics sitting outside the bubble. So I think, just to reaffirm, it's the historian's view and not the government's view, and the official means access to the documents. In terms of the tradition in Australia, it goes back over 100 years now. It very much grew out of the British tradition. We have in Australia produced official histories of the First and Second World Wars, of Korea, of Vietnam, of peacekeeping operations, and now the sixth ever military official history series on East Timor, Iraq, and Afghanistan. I said that it grew out of the British tradition, but it changed very quickly, and it changed during the first ever series. The British tradition tended to have an element of lessons learned for government, often written by people who had had direct experience. The author of the first official history in Australia, those of the Great War, was a war correspondent. He approached his task with elements of sort of nation building to his narrative, and threw out any attempt to do a lessons learned for the military. He very clearly said that was not his job. He didn't have the expertise, and the military should do that themselves. And that tradition has it's certainly remained for a while. It's probably gone a little bit more to including some policy and operational lessons for the military by the nature of who have written the histories. But really, I think that's where the sort of links with Britain begin and end. And the Australian official histories from the start sort of developed this unique flavour in that they focused a lot on the men in the trenches doing the fighting in the First World War, and certainly less on sort of bigger strategic pictures. That has certainly changed. The official histories we do today look at political and strategic matters right down to the soldiers on the ground, but we do maintain that personal aspect of the official histories, what the private soldier in the trench or on an operation thought about a particular experience. So that is still there, and that means we sort of have these very broad histories from top to bottom and across departments. So we will look at decision making at a government level throughout the bureaucracy, and how that's then implemented to practical outcomes on the ground, whether it's diplomats, whether it's aid workers, whether it's the military, whether it's politicians. So we try and cover all of that. So most of the focus in Australia in official histories has been on the military or on military operations and campaigns, but we have done 2 official history series of intelligence agencies. One, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, which is the equivalent of MI5. I was lucky enough to work on that project, and a more recent one on the Australian Signals Directorate, so the equivalent of GCHQ, the Signals Intelligence Agency in Australia. I didn't work on that one, but there are some, I think, important differences between the military and the intelligence series that are worth pointing out. The military ones are cabinet endorsed, and so those conducting the military official histories have access to records, official records across departments. That might be from Foreign Affairs, that might be from Defence, that might be from the Federal Police, and that might be from the intelligence agencies or whatever. But you have the right to privileged access from multiple departments. With the intelligence official histories, they're still official because you have access to those official records, but they have been generated by the intelligence agencies themselves, those projects. And so the teams that write those have the right of access to the records of that agency and not across other departments. So even if the sort of methodological approach is the same, and even if it's the same people working on these projects, and I've done that, I've worked on both intelligence and military official history series, there is a slight difference in terms of the breadth of your access and then therefore the scope of what you can focus on. I've spoken a little bit about scope. I think I wanted to reinforce that it's not a sort of government inquiry. We're not in Australia, have never been given questions that the government wants answered. It's almost a case of they want an official history for whatever reason that might be. It could be that they think it's time, it's been too long, or that there's agitation from historical groups or veterans groups to produce these things. But generally we want you to go and produce a history of war X, and then it's up to the historians to figure out how they do that, how they structure the books, what they will examine and what they won't. And again, we can come back to all of that sort of in question time. The result of all of this are really big books, big reference books. They are written, or we try to write them for a popular audience, in that we try and reduce the amount of sort of bureaucratic talk and military language, so that anyone can understand it. You don't need to have specific knowledge of how a military works. We try and explain that. But the reality is they're also big reference books that others will use for future studies. And I think we would be kidding ourselves if we expected too many people, other than the people that are working in these fields, to read these books, and they're multiple volumes, to read them from cover to cover. They're written so that they can be read that way, but there's also a lot of cross-referencing and reminding people that, you know, this was discussed in chapter 20 and to go and have a look there. But they will be public books after they're cleared, and the clearance process in Australia is quite different from certainly the clearance process in the Netherlands, and perhaps we'll come back to that in question time. There are a whole bunch of challenges that come with producing official histories, I think both for those commissioned to produce them, so the historians, but also for the departments on the other end that have got to help produce the material. Certainly in our case for Afghanistan, we don't own, our project doesn't own any of the records. We have to go to departments, and we're requesting hundreds of thousands of documents. And there is a lot of work required on the other side to be able to provide those. And so, it's a big project for everyone involved. There's challenges with getting access to records. Even when you're an official history project, it's not like all the records just turn on all of a sudden, and you have to deal with multiple parts of a bureaucracy. There's the challenges of writing, and that is, the scope of records that you have to research and understand, and particularly in a digital project like contemporary official histories, bring these other challenges for us as historians, where we've had to sort of retrain how we work with digital born files as opposed to paper files. The challenges of writing, that can be down to, we've got timelines, but also the expectations of how detailed you need to be in an official history, because you've got that privileged access, because these need to be works that stand on their own for a long time. And then the other, I think, fourth major challenge of an official history, certainly today, is the clearance process. Turning these volumes that are currently classified, because they're based on access to classified material, they have to go through a system that turns them into an unclassified manuscript that can be sent to a publisher and turned into a book. And that is a difficult process for everyone involved, and a frustrating process, I think, for everyone involved on any project, because everyone cares about the work that they put into these. Richard had sent some questions, and there have been some of the questions and themes that we've been touching on in this seminar series, and I thought I would address some of them directly, and I think then we can have some good discussions about them, and certainly it'll lead again to some of those similarities and differences that Azarja, I'm sure, will tell us about. But one of those was why governments commission them, official histories. I think in Australia, largely it's because of that tradition. We have kept doing them. There's not been any big pause without them. Politicians and military officers and diplomats are familiar with these books. Whether they've read them is a different matter, but they're certainly there. The names associated with producing some of these official histories are public names. Charles Bean, who wrote the first World War official histories, also created the Australian War Memorial, which is a very big public institution, and everyone in Australia knows what that institution is. So that tradition helps. The role of Anzac and sort of Australian First World War myths and the place of Anzac in Australian society helps generate, I think, interest in these topics, but also pressure on the governments to commission official histories. There's an element of those, sense of those who deploy on military operations deserve their stories to be told, and to tell those well, government needs to fund big independent research projects on that, which is essentially what the official history is. Richard also raised this question of whether we can trust historians if they're the only ones allowed to see documents. I smirk because when I did worked on the intelligence official history in Australia, a lot of our footnotes in the published version removed the details of of the source's origins. So sometimes our footnote just said ASIO document or ASIO file or something like that. So there is an element of trust us, which is sort of never really sits that comfortable, I think, from a scholarly perspective, but also I think it's sort of like a trust us for now. One day these documents will be available, and one day we will be accountable, and we will rightly be criticised if we've misused material, if we've missed material that's been in our possession. I certainly, the records that I keep for my Afghanistan official history are very much accountable. My drafts are there, my correspondence are there, and one day that material will be available to other scholars. So I think it's a matter of time where we will then be tested. We generally, as official historians, we are the first to use the files, but we're not the only ones to ever use those files. So it's a complicated question, and something that can only be improved by improving access to records for every researcher in a more timely manner. I think also, as historians, we have to prove our working out. We have to have footnotes. We have to show how we know things. I'm not using anonymous sources in my official history. Everything is footnoted with a link directly to where that file is. And so I'm held accountable through our usual scholarly practices. Another question is whether we can be sure that the official historian has seen all the relevant documents. And I think we shouldn't get too caught up in whether they've seen all the relevant documents. The actual question is whether they've been in a position to see all of those documents that they deem relevant. We can't read everything. I have access to so much material that I can't possibly, even with full-time research assistants, I cannot possibly read it all. So I can't say I've read everything of relevance, because we have to triage hundreds of thousands of documents and choose which ones we will focus on, because time limits require it. If the answer is no, they can't say hand on heart that they've been able to access all of those documents that they deemed relevant, then the historians absolutely should acknowledge that. We should acknowledge our limitations, whether they're self-imposed or imposed as part of the project. But I don't think that's any different than what we would usually do as historians, acknowledging any limitations of, you know, the archive was destroyed, so I can't know about that. So I do think there's a nuance there, and I don't think, certainly for big contemporary projects, we can't kid ourselves into thinking that we can read everything. And that's a real change in mindset as a historian that took me years to get comfortable with. You know that you have material in your possession and it might be the gold nugget, and you will never see it because you can't read everything. Another one was whether there's a danger of the official historian becoming institutionalized or too close to their subjects. Yes, of course. But I think there is for any study. Again, you need to put in place processes to deal with that. My first ever history project was on the First World War, and all of the subjects had passed away. I'm now writing about a subject where those people are very much still alive and in positions of authority and power and with reputations, and some of them have become my friends. So you have to have internal processes to deal with that. And I can certainly answer if people are wondering what those processes are. But we can always get too close to our subjects. We can always get institutionalized. There is a benefit in Australia in the official historians coming from outside of government, though. And I think whether that is a real difference in terms of how the work is done, or a perception of the independence of those historians, I do think it is a valuable thing for those Australian projects. And lastly, is there a role for official histories in an era of freedom of information? Absolutely. Official histories are big projects that cost lots of money, and they give people time, where it's their full-time job, to understand the nuance of these matters. Freedom of information is fantastic. The documents are still redacted, and people have to know what they're requesting. To request it, they need to know what to ask for. When you can sit inside a department and say, I want all of that in that digital filing cabinet, there is a freedom that comes with that and allows you to kind of swim in the records and figure it out as you're going. And I don't think FOI allows for that. I think my last point, Patrick, and then I'm going to be quiet and move on to Azarja, and relates to this, is history is a conversation. We are absolutely going to get things wrong in official histories. I will get things wrong in my official history. I think we all need to be comfortable with that. There are shortcuts we need to take in producing these because they are huge bodies of work. Even though we're very well funded with lots of time, they are still massive projects. My Afghanistan book is already at 500,000 words. These are huge projects. History is a conversation. Others are going to come along after us. They will see the bits we've got wrong. They will correct it. They will improve on our work, and will be all the better for future scholars having done that. So that's what I've got to say, and I'll happily take questions after Azarja says his piece.
That's really, really interesting. Lots of resonances with even just last week's seminar, lots of similarities between the British and the Australian traditions, but also differences. I mean, Australians have a much more continuous experience of official history than we do. Ours is much more stop and go. So good for Australia. We'll move straight on if we may. Azarja, please take over. And you're on mute.
Thank you so much. I'll try to share my screen. All right, if that's all set. Thanks so much for inviting us today and talk about our nation's traditions in official history. My talk will be a little bit different from the one that Rhys just gave. I'd like to make clear from the outset that the Netherlands does not have a standing tradition in official history the way it is known in the UK or Australia. So in other words, we do not have an official tradition in official history, if you will. So what I would like to do now is take the current Dutch Afghanistan research project, in which I'm involved as well, and Rhys plays a part, as a reference point, and from there trace the origins of their projects in our nation's background in state commissioned or state funded research projects. So in that way, I think we'll get a better understanding of how to situate the Afghanistan project, both in the Dutch society and internationally. So let me start by explaining briefly what the Afghanistan research project is about and why it could be considered an official history project. So it spans the complete 20 years of coalition activities in Afghanistan after the events in 2001. In Operation Enduring Freedom, ISAF, as well as RSM. So it has a broad scope and does not only look at military operations, but also at diplomatic efforts, national discussions on a political level, etc. It started last year and will run until 2027. But who knows? Let's hope we meet that deadline. These kind of big projects tend to get extended sometimes. But I'm confident that we're on the right track to do so. It's a collaboration between two institutes, the NIOD Institute for War, Holocaust, and what's the third? War, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies, excuse me, and the Netherlands Institute of Military History. And I'll come back to that, explaining the backgrounds of both of those institutions later. So here's just a very quick overview of the kind of missions that the Dutch were involved in Afghanistan. And as you can see, these span the whole of the country of Afghanistan and the full length of the coalition presence in that country. So as a cooperation between two institutes, both have their own tradition and institutional history. So in order to understand where this project comes from and how to situate it in Dutch institutions, I think it's helpful to look at those two institutes now. So first, the NEMH tradition, which comes from the former section of military history at the General Staff. So if we define official history with the characteristics of like their government employed, paid, or appointed historians, and second, they are related to military operations or foreign policy, and third, maybe most importantly, they grant special access to classified information. Then I think this military staff section is something of a tradition in that regard, going back to the predecessors of the current Military History Institute, which started producing books on the military history of the Netherlands already in the 19th century. However, for a long time, these books were not written by professional historians, but by military officers or retired army personnel. So these would have special access to military reports necessary to write histories of the wars the Dutch fought in Europe and in the colonies. So that is certainly an element of official history. I would say this tradition took off more after the Second World War, when the so-called Green Series was produced by the military history section of the General Staff. You can see it in the image here. It's called the Green Series just because of the jacket of the books. There was a detailed history of the fighting in the Netherlands during the Second World War, and made extensive use of the operational war diaries sent in by military units. So later on, I think starting from the 1980s, academically trained historians who first served as conscripts and later were just hired from society, joined that military history section, and thus I think it slowly gained a more academic profile. Then in 2005, the different military history sections of the different armed forces branches, we had 4 of them, the Royal Dutch Army, the Air Force, the Navy, and the military police. They merged to form the Netherlands Institute of Military History. And this quickly took shape as a professional historical institute with a civilian director and a largely civilian staff. And I think it's important to remark here that at the time of the establishment of the Institute, the Minister of Defense officially proclaimed the independent nature of the Institute. So it would A, follow the standards of academic institutions and universities. B, it would not be required to follow the government policy on any given subject. And C, of course, it would not be subject to any censorship. So in effect, this created a independent academic institute funded by the Ministry of Defense, which is still quite a unique situation also internationally. And from there, the Military History Institute started producing books that we can, I think, safely call official history publications, on topics such as, on the left, use of chemical weapons in the Dutch army, and on the right, special forces operations. And it's, of course, these kind of topics that require the special access that is so typical for official history projects. So that brings us almost up till the present. So let's move on to the other institute, the NIOD. So going back also to the Second World War, this institute was founded right on the day the Germans surrendered on the 8th of May of 1945. It first was called the Netherlands Institute of War Documentation, so solely focused on the Second World War back then. And in the 1950s, the then famous Dr. Lou de Jong, which you see on the picture here, commenced on his life work, the Kingdom of the Netherlands in the Second World War, a series of, in total, 26 volumes spanning more than 1.5 meters. So Dr. de Jong, he became something of a national historian. He had his own television show. He was often on the radio. Everyone knew him. And this helped establish the reputation of the NIOD as a renowned academic institute. But decades later, when practically everything had been said, what could be said about the Second World War, the Institute had to, of course, broaden its scope and focus on other conflict situations. So first it founded the Institute for Holocaust and Genocide Studies in 2002, and later merged with this institute to form the current NIOD Institute for War, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies, which is the name it carries until this day. And in that same year, 2002, the NIOD published a report on the events leading up to the fall of the safe enclave of Srebrenica in the former Yugoslavia in 1995, and the subsequent murder of more than 7,000 men and boys by the Serbian armed forces. So this report was government commissioned and sought answers to the questions why the Dutch battalion in Srebrenica, called Dutch Bat 3, had been unable to protect the Bosnian population in that area, and why air support never came to their aid. This report had a very big impact. As a result of its conclusions, the whole government cabinet offered their resignation to the Queen of the Netherlands. And relating it to official history, I think this was more a commission report than a official history project. Also having far-reaching political consequences, but still in terms of special access and the involvement of professional historians, I think it was very similar to an official history project. So after Srebrenica, the NIOD did several other projects on more or less controversial aspects of our nation's history, which strengthened their independent position, and they also forged strong connections with the academic world, mainly through the University of Amsterdam. Then 10 years after the Srebrenica report, in 2012, the NIOD and the NEMH decided to collaborate and file a official request together with a third institute, which specialized in colonial matters, to execute a study into extreme violence perpetrated by Dutch troops during the Indonesian War of Independence in the 1940s. So this offer, this request got rejected at first, but it does mark the point in which the two traditions of official history and state-sanctioned research kind of merged and joined forces. And eventually, after an extremely critical dissertation by a Swiss-Dutch historian on extreme violence during the Indonesian National Revolution, in 2016, the government decided to grant the three institutes the financial need to carry out the research. And this project was active from 2016 until 2022. And I was also one of the researchers in the program. I wrote a book on the deployment of heavy weapons during that war, mainly artillery and air support, which was published in Dutch, but is now in the process of being translated. In 2022, combined results were published in a summarizing volume, which is called Beyond the Pale, and you see it on the right of the screen. And the researchers concluded that extreme violence have been structural, deliberate, brutal, and have been allowed or even condoned by those in charge. And these conclusions also had a significant political impact. The government did not step down, but did instead offer an official apology to the state and the people of Indonesia for the acts of violence committed in the years 1945 till 1949. And actually, immediately after this program was finished, the Afghanistan program was launched. As in 2021, the coalition's presence in Afghanistan had come to an abrupt end. And I think this project builds really on the cooperation established in the Indonesia program. So some things are different, such as the fact that this time only 2 institutes are involved instead of 3. Because the other institute, which specialized in colonial history, had less direct relevance for Afghanistan. But one of the main differences, I think, is that this time it had not been an appeal by the institutes themselves, but it had been a request by Parliament after the dramatic events in 2021 in Afghanistan. And another difference is that the Indonesia project didn't have to deal with issues of special access, as most of the archival material was already publicly available. And yeah, this is of course different with the Afghanistan project, which has been given full and unprecedented access to all information deemed relevant. And Yeah, I think this also brings me to one of the questions that were sent to us beforehand. Because in the case of our project, at the end, the agreement is that all the sources we reference will be declassified at the end, and thus will be available to other researchers to check on our work. So I don't think that will solve all issues of transparency with researching classified sources, but I think it is a really big step in the right direction. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more about those questions and give like a brief answer that we can maybe elaborate on afterwards. So why does the Dutch government commission official histories? Well, I hope to have shed a little bit of light on that already, that mostly these are controversial episodes in our nation's history, at least in recent decades, that has been the case. Formerly, they focused more on the wars that had taken place. The second I've just answered before. And so can we be sure that official historians have seen all the documents? I think the simple answer is no, but that holds for all research, of course. And so that's where also I think that there is still a gap in transparency, because we will share, of course, the documents that are declassified, but other researchers will not have access to all the documents that have been looked at or could have been looked at. So they will have to trust us for the time being that we looked at those. And yes, I agree fully with Rhys that we do run a risk of getting too close to our subjects. And I also agree that is a risk for all history projects or all research projects. And but we've always been lucky with a lot of public scrutiny. We've been criticized from all directions in the Indonesia project. Also, we've seen in the Afghanistan projects that really the general public keeps us sharp in that regard. And I don't think we can afford to getting too cozy with those in power. So that is really something of a check, I think, in that sense. So is there still a role for official history in the era of freedom of information? I really think there is, because I think there are both aspects of achieving accountability. They both have their own role to play. Freedom of information requests are a very important tool also for journalists, but they rarely get full access to the files they request. They are very often redacted. So it's a different way of holding those in power to account than an official history project. So I think they're both very important. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, that was again fascinating, really interesting, and showing how public history can be done even if it's not by a government body. There's plenty of other ways to do it. If people want to start asking questions, please start raising your hand or writing in the chat. Of course, I do have my own thoughts and comments, which I might actually start with. I think that both of you are highly reassuring. I really like the sense in which Rhys was saying your history is provisional, just like everybody else's is. It just comes from a slightly different starting point. Trust us for now, and I think we all feel that that one day we will be held to account in one way or other. So that is highly reassuring. And I know that some of the products of the Australian project already exist. Craig Stocking's History of East Timor, for instance. But I mean, I have been reading the reviews of that book, very, very favourable reviews, but nearly all of them comment on the difficulty that there has existed in the clearance process. Is that a thing we can talk about? I mean, what sorts of issues arise when an independent historian like that comes up against the bureaucracies and their vested interests?
Yeah, I think I sort of want to be a bit limited in what I say here. So I work on the same project that East Timor volume is part of. It's pretty well documented that clearance process took a long time. It took longer to clear the volume than it did to write the volume. And that is frustrating, I think, for everyone. It's certainly frustrating for the historians, and I'm sure it's frustrating for the people doing the clearance. They're against other deadlines, and there are time pressures, and all of that factors into it. I have some visibility of an understanding of the Dutch clearance process, and I think perhaps Azarja might be able to talk to that as well. And I think it is in theory, it is a timelier and more robust clearance process from an accountability and transparency perspective than I think the one we have in Australia, which just takes a long time. Partly that is also a result of the books that we produce. Craig's East Timor, so Professor Craig Stocking's East Timor volume, the first of our official history project to be finished, I think is probably around 250 to 300,000 words. It's a big book. It will be the smallest book in our series by a long way. So these things just take a long time. But ultimately, I mean, these works are important enough to go through that process. It is important enough to fight every point you, as the historian, deems you need to fight against. I'm not saying this happened in that instance, but it is easy for people to dress up concerns as national security, and that's the bureaucracy that can do that. But it needs to be a discussion, and it can't be an attempt to censor views or not deal with the uncomfortable or embarrassing things. And so the integrity of the clearance process matters and has to be upheld, because without that integrity, the official history tradition might as well end. And without that integrity, the works can be questioned, and also, your own personal integrity as a historian who, works in a field and needs to uphold those very foundations of the disciplines that we work in. So I think integrity is key. But yeah, of course, it's frustrating. The intelligence official histories, I think, were harder in that regard, in that it was a line-by-line clearance, because they were top secret drafts, and they had to become unclassified drafts, and that's a long, very meticulous process.
You mentioned that the Dutch operate these things differently. Is that the case, Azarja? How does it work?
I don't have intimate knowledge of the Australian process, but I do understand from what Rhys has said that it is quite lengthy. For now, the results that we have been getting so far, with the first volume being cleared, it's pretty hopeful. So not having a lot of delays. That said, we had some delays in getting access for everybody and getting clearance for everyone, because we've gained access to so many different departments, and arrangement had to be made with all of these different departments, waiving our official documents and assuring them that we really were allowed to look at those documents, even in branches or institutes that are really not used to those kind of inquiries. So that really took a lot of time. But in the eventual declassification process, that is pretty promising so far.
Good, that is helpful. Sue has some comments. Why not make documents available digitally and online rather than publish official history? But I suspect that in a way you've both answered that. There is room for both. I don't know whether that would be the correct answer. I don't know whether you can read Sue's comments in the chat.
If I might jump into that, I immediately thought about a discussion that has been going on in the Netherlands about a very sensitive archive that the National Archives has been planning to fully make available online, which is the archive of people collaborating with the Germans or even fighting for the Germans in the Second World War. And there was a whole legal process afterwards in investigating these people. And so it has been postponed time and again because people have been so concerned that the the files will be taken out of context and will create outrage for some specific acts or persons that are unable to react to that or defend themselves anymore. So what that shows, I think, is the importance of history writing and making those studies that you can put them into context, have an honest balance between different sources, and then offering your analysis. And so I think just making everything available does not solve all the issues either.
Yeah.
But it can, of course, be also one of the ways to improve accountability and transparency.
Sure. Richard, you wish to intervene.
Yeah, I was going to ask you a question about something you didn't mention. And I think I've heard Rhys talk about this in the past, but it's when we talk about official history, we're often talking about documents, looking at documents. But it's about oral history and integrating interviews with officials, because I think, Rhys, you said that you do a lot of oral history interviews, which you integrate into the volumes. And I wondered, is that oral history tradition something that's always been there in the Australian series, or is it something that you've introduced? And similarly, in the Netherlands, are you just looking at documents, or are you also doing a lot of oral history interviews, particularly for the more contemporary projects where there's obviously a lot of officials and soldiers still alive? And do you think there's a benefit there to integrating that at this stage in with the documentary stuff?
Yeah, sure. I'll quickly also answer Sue's questions because I think certainly one of them pertains directly to Australia. I think, Sue, hopefully you're still there listening. You won't get any argument from me that more documents or all documents shouldn't be made available to the public. That is not something that I, as a historian, control. That's got to be a government or government department's decisions. I think, quite frankly, our culture of release in Australia is different to that in America. It's much more risk averse, and our archives are not properly funded, nor do I think they release nearly enough material. What a benefit of an official history can do is, in that interim period before documents reach their 20-year rule, we can have access to them before they get to that. But we don't have a culture in Australia of proactive release to the archives from our departments. Quite frankly, I think many of the department's records are a complete mess, which makes the job for the archives much harder. And the result of that is a third of the material from the Royal Commission into British nuclear tests in Australia not yet having been examined by the archives for release. The second part of that is, why still produce these big books? I think there's definitely still room for big books, but they shouldn't be the only thing. And if there are huge volumes of documents that can be made available to the public and to other researchers, we all benefit from that. Richard, as to your question, yes, we do a lot of oral histories in all the official histories that I've worked in. It's not a new tradition. If we think back to the First and Second World War official histories, both of which were led by journalist war correspondents, they had interviewed soldiers on the front line, and they had written their answers in their journals and their diaries and in their reporting. So there's not a formal sit down with a recorder oral history tradition there, but it informed from the very beginning those soldier perspectives or the inside accounts of things that aren't written down in our official histories, and we retain that. To give the audience a bit of a sense of the scope of official history interviews these days, my book on Afghanistan has over 600 interviews just for a period of 2005 to 2010. And I don't know how many documents, but hundreds of thousands. And yeah, over 600 interviews, and they get, they're very useful in educating us, educating me. And so my colleagues in the project have done similar numbers of interviews. We've got thousands of interviews. They educate us, they provide leads, and they give colour to things that aren't written down, because not everything is in an archive. We know the limits of an archive. So it is a tradition, it is important. Yes, there are pitfalls, but you can be, there's things we can do as historians to incorporate that in a very careful but useful way.
Azarja, did you want to also speak on the same subject?
Yes, it's a very interesting question, and I'm very much a believer in doing both, like history study in written sources as well as in oral history projects, and doing like maybe a more multi-perspectivity in your approach. And in the Indonesia project, actually, there was a bit of a divide between people who were very much proponents of a oral history approach, and people more focused on the written sources. But again, I think the strengths could lie in combining those two, and also the time that historians could get away with just studying the military reports and then saying this is the story, but basically you only have the perspective of the military commanders. We can't get away with that anymore, and so we have to diversify our perspectives. And so one of the we have a full-time researcher interviewing Afghan people in the Netherlands as well. So apart from all the officials and those involved on the Dutch side, we also make a conscious effort to incorporate Afghan perspectives on these histories.
Rhys, when you said 600 interviews, did you conduct every one of them, or did you have research assistants helping you?
It's a team effort. The whole thing is a team effort.
Right.
And some of those are interviews that the military had done itself for its own purposes, and because they're official records, we have access to those as well. I don't know the number, but I mean, probably I guess 450 of those have been conducted by our team. So that's usually 2 or 3 people that have done the majority of those, and they probably average 2 hours an interview, some longer than that. And we write them up as summaries more than transcripts. Transcripts just become too resource intensive.
And you must have a set of questions that you ask every person, all roughly the same format, do you, or does it vary?
Not really, no. I think we did at the start, but we have become more comfortable in the interview process that you have certain things you want to get out of them. So they're semi-structured interviews, but to a large extent, you want the interview to go where it needs to go and where the person wants to take it, and just sort of will try and steer them back or get them to explain something. So it's a really individual, I think, case by case basis. We interview prime ministers to privates, coalition generals. Azarja's project is doing a lot of work with Afghan communities. So you can't sort of have a templated questions, because every situation and experience is really quite different. The common factor is they all relate something to do with Afghanistan, and that's probably about it.
Yeah. Any more questions before we move on?
There is another one there from Sue, which I can see.
Sue, yeah, did you want to pick up on that one?
Yeah, Sue, it's a challenge. The war crimes allegations, when we began the official history project, they weren't public. I certainly didn't know anything of those allegations when I started work. Also, when we began work on the project, Afghanistan was still in coalition hands, and obviously that changed in 2021. So what it does, I think, these new sort of earth-shattering revelations is cause you to rethink some of your conclusions. In particular, with the war crimes allegations, there's a big redacted report on that in Australia, and it makes very clear that it raises very clear concerns about the accuracy or honesty of operational reporting. And so, of course, we were tracking that the records don't have everything in them anyway, but it does cause, or certainly caused me to start reading those records in a different way and start asking other questions of the primary sources that I probably, or not probably, that I wasn't asking the first time around. So there are sort of real complexities that come with these difficult matters. In terms of, does it control what we write? Absolutely not. And we just have to see how that plays out. We acknowledge the allegations within the draft official histories, but I sort of have no more special knowledge on those allegations than you would, Sue, in being a member of the public. So I said before about the limitations of our studies. We need to acknowledge that, and that is at the limitation of our official history. I have no more detailed knowledge of what those specific allegations than any other normal member of the public. And it is what it is, and we'll put that up front, and people can make their own judgments on what that means for our history and what it does and does not do.
Thank you very much. Okay, I have one more question, or for now anyway. One of the things you said, Rhys, was that as you're working through the files, you're now having to deal with digital-born files. Now, this is an area we're all moving into, and in the Foreign Office context as well, our files from the 90s onwards are increasingly digital, and you're having to learn how to use them. How do you learn?
Slowly and uncomfortably, I think, is the answer. We're all used to going to an archive and requesting the file and reading it back to front and knowing whatever was on that desk officer's desk, what was important, what they were doing the day before and the day after. So we get all of this context from the physical creation of a file. We do not have that anymore. There are huge problems even with metadata in digital files. It could be a template that was created 10 years before that people have kept using. So the creation date becomes impossible to tell. And if someone then may edit it, accidentally open it and save it instead of just closing it, that changes the end date as well. So we have this real challenge, and I actually think it's been impossible for us to solve a challenge of understanding the context of documents. We all know our own, I guess, personal practices. We might have a folder on our desktop called Rhys's stuff, and in that might be Rhys's draft 1, draft 2, final 2, final 3. So knowing which is the final of something is problematic. There's so much duplication. But I think the biggest challenge is of scale. It is so easy to mass produce digital documents and duplicate it. It is very, very difficult. Our solution was to kind of accept that we wouldn't know those things, that wider context, and actually to print out all documents and create our own archival structure. Well, we had archivists do it for us, that follow the sort of standard archival structure that anyone who's worked in an archive will be familiar with. And we create our own working files that are basically an amalgamation of documents from wherever they happen to be printed from. And then we put them into order and we create essentially a topic file or a subject file or a chronological file, whatever we deem necessary for our own working purposes. And we're the first to have created essentially that folder with all that material. Now that means our archive, so because we have created an archive in the Official History Project, that archive will be very valuable to researchers for a very long time. And it includes things that we have printed and never got around to reading because there's too much of it. I think AI is probably the answer, but it's not something that I've had experience with. But I think AI with some very tech-savvy systems and people is a way that you can help sift through the scale, because still we did it as humans and reverted to essentially those old practices that we are comfortable and familiar with. Azarja, do you have anything to add?
Thanks, Rhys. Yeah, well, taking you up on the last point of AI may be a solution or a partial solution. We are experimenting with that. There are some tools available, but of course we are limited because of the classified nature of the documents, and we can't use publicly available AI tools because that stuff will end up in the cloud, and it's not something we can do. So we are a bit limited in that sense, but looking more into the future, I 100% agree that will be very much helpful for us to sort them. But then again, also AI has to deal with incomplete material and human errors that have been made that can no longer be corrected. And so also other problems that we run into in terms of not only like how definitive is a file, but also, for example, the location of a file, how to refer to it when it's extracted from a floppy disk, and no one will know what a floppy disk is in a few years anymore. It's just a save button in Word. But so we have been creating, partly because of that, a copy archive with our own structure that makes more sense and is more easy to refer to, and will also be easier to look up for future historians. And another thing we've been dealing with is because of the period, especially the early years in Afghanistan, this was a transition period from paper to digital. And the archiving systems were very amateuristic in that time. And I'm not blaming the people in that time because it was new and the system was not yet in place, and the operating procedures. So one thing that had to be done, and is still an ongoing process, is getting all the archives in the right location and archiving them according to the articles of law that need to be followed. So that process has not been finished, and still we already have to do our research. So yeah, there's some challenges in that sense.
It's very interesting that you're both evolving similar answers to these problems by, in a way, constructing your own archives. And I suppose, I never thought about it, but official historians like you are at the forefront because you're dealing with documents that are more recent than almost anybody else can actually access. So your methods and experiences might be of much wider relevance as time goes on. Any more comments or questions? Looks like Philip, you have one.
Yeah, and question to both our speakers. Do you have any anecdotal evidence about how the work that you've done has been used by policymakers themselves, what they found particularly useful? And I'm particularly interested, of course, in whether Rhys's book on ASIO has been used or found useful by intelligence officers within that organization, whether you've had any kind of feedback about that.
I haven't had any direct feedback. You can imagine that when you finish working on an intelligence agency official history, you don't tend to keep having a relationship with the intelligence agency. Your special access is cut off, and that's the end of that. But I think that history in particular has been used in a policy sense. We do these regular sort of 5-yearly reviews in Australia into the current intelligence community and sort of what the future intelligence community should look like. And there was, it wasn't actually one of those, but it was another inquiry into intelligence matters. And it it lent very heavily on the ASIO official histories. So, I mean, not just my book, but the books by all of us, to talk about the importance of agencies knowing their history, and that, that rather than having a sort of historical amnesia, we can deal with contemporary issues if we understand the history of these organisations. And the only way that occurs in a sort of useful policy sense is by giving people access to the records and giving them the experience that I had. I think Afghanistan is too, well, it's not completed yet, the book, so it hasn't had a direct sort of, in a publication sense, hasn't had a direct influence, but our work and our expertise, our nuanced expertise within our team, has certainly been sought in other reviews. There was a lessons learned review that the Department of Defence did, and I and my colleagues spent a lot of time with the people that conducted that review, because we've got the head full of knowledge, right, in a nuanced way. Our official historian has appeared before the Australian Senate on its inquiries into Afghanistan-related matters. So I mean, there are direct benefits in that way to our policymakers. I would like to hope that as many of our decision makers as possible can read these books, because they do offer lessons for them in what does and does not look right and what does or does not work. And it's better, I think, I'm all about having lessons from history and contemporary history. It plays a really useful role in that, because the same people making the decisions are the same people we're writing about. It's always the, what impact does your work have question is a difficult one, because the metrics are generally quantitative, but that's a harder one to fix.
I happen to notice that ASIO's 2023-24 annual report has a picture of the Petrovs on the front, so they clearly have an interest in their history. Yeah,
and the Director General does an annual threat assessment, and he has been, and I don't know if this is because of our books, but he has been referring a lot to history in the last couple of years, and drawing sort of links between current sort of threats and concerns with those historical ones. And I would imagine that they are informed by the big hefty volumes that his organisation paid for.
Any more thoughts or comments? We've had a fantastic discussion, and it's so interesting how much contrast and similarity there is between the various different programs, whatever their origin. A lot of us are facing the same challenges, and I think also achieving things. Both in the Netherlands and Australia, I was very impressed by the way in which they contribute to a sort of public understanding of history. Perhaps a little more than in the British case, where in a way that linkage has been weakened, if I can put it that way. Right, I think we should wrap up soon, unless anybody has any more questions. But again, thank you very much, both of you. It's been wonderful to have these different international perspectives.